Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. This is Erin, and I am joined by the Mark Antony to my Cleopatra, or wait, is it the other way around? I don't know. My husband, Matt.
Hi, everybody. I'm here. I hope we have a better ending than they did.
Matt, spoilers. Come on.
Sorry.
Matt has so kindly helped fill in for Jamie, and he's here today to help me finish up Mark Antony's story. This is the time in his life that you are all probably most familiar with, especially his relationship with Cleopatra and the very, very, very bitter end to Antony's story, which Matt already referenced. So buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Just a trigger warning before we begin. Unfortunately, if you know the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, there's going to be talk of suicide and self-harm in this episode, so proceed with caution.
Absolutely. We don't want to make light of that.
No, and there will be some even before we get to their story. So there's a lot of talk of suicide. So if that bugs you, this might not be the episode for you. We've got the warning. Now we can proceed ahead. So we left off last time, if you remember, with the purge that the members of the Second Triumvirate had done in Rome with the famous orator Cicero as its most famous victim. I still hate Cicero. Nothing's changed about that. So to me, I say good riddance.
He's not going to get an episode because you've pretty much made up your mind about Cicero.
Well, maybe if somebody else did it and you could try to convince me otherwise. I do want to steal a phrase from the fabulous Betty Davis. You should never say bad things about the dead, only good. Cicero is dead. Good. Got to make light of it because there's not going to be a ton of lightness in this episode. So we got to take it.
What's the Alice Roosevelt line? If you don't have anything nice to say about anybody, please come sit next to me.
You got to love Alice. Okay, so Cicero's dead. Still, the real order of business for the Second Triumvirate, the reason for its very creation, was to finally take care of the liberators, who are the murderers of Julius Caesar. They are the avengers, quite literally, I guess. They're out for vengeance. The time that Brutus and Cassius had been given, it was up. It was time to make them pay.
So we're going to start off with some bloodshed.
We are. And if that mission wasn't complicated enough, if that wasn't enough for the Second Triumvirate, they actually had another problem. Sextus Pompey, he's the last remaining son of Pompey the Great, who was killed in our first episode. Just to recap, Pompey the Great fought a civil war against Julius Caesar and ended up dead in Egypt, R.I.P., with his head presented to Caesar as a gift. So Sextus Pompey would become a major pain in the butt for the triumvirate. At this point, he had taken control of Sicily, which Rome relied on for their grain supply. So he's able to sit on top of this pile of grain like a dragon on top of its treasure. Sextus Pompey wanted recognition and he wanted official power, but the triumvirs were unwilling to grant it, at least at this point. He would outlast the liberators and continue to trouble the triumvirate for a long time. He becomes something of a pirate off the coast of Sicily. So this is not the last time we will hear of him by far, but just an FYI that they've got troubles other than just the liberators. Now, back to the liberators. If the battle was not already deeply personal, it got even more so. Mark Antony's brother Gaius was killed by Brutus. He had been in Macedonia, and after initially being kept alive by Brutus, being relatively well treated, he eventually was executed. We don't have time to get into all the details about the fights against the liberators because we've got a lot to cover this episode, but what you need to know is that it came to an end in the famous Battle of Philippi on October 3rd, 42 BC. That's the famous last stand for the liberators in Macedonia. At the end of it, Brutus and Cassius would both be dead at their own hands. Julius Caesar, at long last, had been avenged. Mark Antony was the real hero of the day for the Battle of Philippi. No one believed Octavian could have pulled this off alone. In fact, Octavian was very sick in the lead up, often having to be carried in a litter. He hardly seemed well enough to fight, let alone win a battle. It's with this victory that Mark Antony solidified himself in the pantheon of great Roman generals. His star would likely never be higher.
So he's no longer just the idle playboy who had managed to come into the orbit of powerful men. He has some of his own standing now in the Roman world. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to say that he's been discounted before this, but it is really with that. He's certainly the head of the triumvirs. He has this victory again. Octavian's forces are there, but everybody knows who actually won the battle. It's Mark Antony. So he's definitely on his way to becoming, the next Caesar, the next Pompey the Great in terms of military reputation. In the aftermath of Philippi, Antony appeared more restrained compared to Octavian, which also helped his reputation. Octavian, he took almost sadistic pleasure in making those who had fought with the liberators pay. This is a trigger warning here. There's this absolutely bone-chilling tale of Octavian forcing a father and son who fought for the other side to throw dice to determine who would live and who would die. And then Octavian laughing as the survivor committed suicide over the other's body.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's dark.
It's stomach-churning. Stuff that you usually don't get about Octavian because he's so sanitized after he becomes emperor. We don't hear about Mark Antony acting in this way. He maintained the sense of decorum, recognizing that these men were still Romans, even if they fought for the other side. When Brutus's body arrived at Mark Antony's camp, he covered it with his own cloak. He wanted to plan a funeral for Brutus, while Octavian wanted Brutus's head to be cut off and put at the feet of a statue of Caesar back in Rome.
Oh.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of a contrast. Luckily for the head, it was lost at sea before it could get to Rome. So it was not placed next to Caesar's statue. I will say that Mark Antony did get one piece of revenge in, though. Not against the murderers of Caesar, but the man who killed his brother Gaius. So Antony put that man to death by his brother's tomb. Is that any better than what Octavian did with Brutus? Maybe? I don't know.
Seems pretty similar.
Yeah, maybe a little slightly more sedate. Maybe the one with Brutus, but at least he's not playing any weird games with the dice. I'll say that. Now came the real work, though. With the liberators gone, the ordinary business of running an empire needed to be the first priority. The triumvirate had a lot on their plate in order to put the Roman world as they knew it back together again. Civil wars are messy. There's a messy aftermath. There are thousands of veterans to settle, which meant finding land for them, never easy. Sextus Pompey still had to be dealt with, and the East was a hot mess and needed major attention. This is where you see the triumvirate first divide up the empire. Much later, you'd get the tetrarchy when there was 4 emperors stationed in sort of the hot spots of the empire, the places that were having issues. This isn't quite that, but you could see it as kind of a precursor to the tetrarchy, except with the 3 men instead of 4. So Lepidus, him.
I had almost forgotten about Lepidus.
I know, he's still there. He's hanging out. He's still there. He'd be governor of Africa, nominally. He would never exert any real power compared to the other 2 triumvirs. Octavian would get Spain, Sicily, and greatest of all, Italy. His main responsibility in the aftermath of the end of the Liberators' War would be to settle all those veterans of the war. Make no mistake, it's a monumental task. He was also expected to mop up the Sextus Pompey problem. Mark Antony gained Gaul and its 17 legions, though he'd mainly leave the heavy lifting to his deputies there. The real focus was on the East, which needed serious reorganization after the liberators had built up their power there before the Civil War. We talked a little bit in last episode that they had been left to leave Rome, Brutus and Cassius, and they had gone out east. Well, the East is a little bit of a mess now, so it's up to Mark Antony to put it in its place. While some punishment was in order for those who had supported the liberators, the East was largely depleted of supplies and cash, and it required a complete overhaul. More importantly, for Antony's legacy, he was gearing up for war against Parthia, which is like modern-day Iran. Why Parthia? Do you remember Parthia? We've mentioned it before.
Yes, and this is going to be the conflict where isn't Cleopatra going to provide him with a lot of support for this conflict?
Yes. But do you know why he's gearing up towards Parthia? Do you remember? We mentioned Parthia before. Pop quiz.
Had they previously maintained an alliance against Rome?
It's mainly due to the Crassus issue. Crassus, during the first triumvirate with Poppy and Caesar. Remember, he had battle there and met his demise there.
Oh, right, and they
swallow gold.
Right, and they did not give him a fitting end.
No, and they have the standards, the banners, basically, of his legion still there. For the Romans, that's not good. That makes them mad. It's like a nationalistic thing.
Yeah, this is a huge issue in American history. If you see how I retreat into the one little clubhouse where I have some rudimentary knowledge.
There's going to be a lot of retreats in this episode, so retreat away.
But throughout the second half of the 19th century, after the Civil War, the South wanted its colors returned that had been seized in Confederate defeats, especially towards the end of the war. And Grover Cleveland may have lost an election.
Oh, really?
Because in a gesture of goodwill towards the vanquished Confederacy, he ordered a lot of Confederate battle flags, company flags that were in the possession of what was then called the War Department, what we'd now call the Defense Department, returned to Confederate capitals.
Grover, no! Grover, no! I've seen some of the flags in Minnesota at the...
Yes, when you go to the top of the St. Paul, there's a beautiful Capitol building, and you go to the top there.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably 2 or 3 dozen of them up there. But anyway, it was...
Go Union!
Yeah, well, I know that we probably look at an invasion of Parthia purely on the basis of, the Roman honor code as not something that would justify the loss of life and the expenditure it's probably going to require. But no, it makes sense in context. It definitely does.
Yeah, it's a deep wound for them. I had mentioned it, that Caesar had planned an expedition to Parthia before his assassination. He was gearing up to do that, which is why the assassination was kind of rushed, and they had to do it then before he went on campaign, which would take years. So now, as the victor of Philippi, Antony would be the man for the job. He had made the liberators pay. Next up was Parthia on the vengeance tour. But I do want to say Mark Antony misplayed his hand with taking the East. Perhaps he was blinded by the wealth of the East and the allure of military glory in Parthia. Or maybe he just didn't think it through, but giving Octavian Italy was a giant mistake. It was a huge one. I see this as one of those pivotal moments, those forks in history that could have changed everything if it had gone another way. But by giving up Italy and heading east, Mark Antony lost his chance to consolidate power in the capital, ceding it entirely to Octavian. And Octavian, that sneaky motherfucker, set about building his loyal following and reputation by taking care of the veterans of the war with the liberators. Like we said, he had a lot of veterans to settle on land, a problem. We discussed land reform. We discussed all that back in our first episode on Antony. Not an easy task.
Right.
Now, thousands of soldiers needed pay and land, and they would owe it all to Octavian. It's setting the stage. These are things that maybe don't seem like a big deal right now, but they're going to come back to haunt Mark Antony. Mark Antony left Rome for Athens to wait out the winter in 42 BC into the year 41. Athens would become his main base, a place he would come back to time and time again. And he really enjoyed himself in Greece. He's going to the theater. It's almost as if he's shaking off the stress of the last couple years.
That's understandable. Plus, this was where he came out, publicly as a prominent Roman, right? It was late in life, but this is where he first kind of etched his name in the stars of Roman history. So, sure.
Yeah. You have to think about it. Since Caesar's assassination, his life has been nonstop chaos and war. The man had been through a lot. Now the culture and life in Athens put him back together again. He'd be up to his old tricks. Womanizing with actresses, drinking to excess, loving life. It sounds amazing. But hey, I think in this case, you could say the man earned it. At least in Athens, he was away from the watchful eye of Octavian and all those who were looking for any misstep. After winter passed, Antony was once again on the move. As he entered into the province of Asia, this is where you could say Mark Antony started to become more Eastern. You mentioned that in our first part, that the one thing you knew about him was that he started wearing his Eastern dress. Well, that's kind of what happens here.
The scandalously cut tunic.
Yeah. He's called the new Dionysus or Bacchus in the Roman pantheon. I'm assuming you know who Dionysus and Bacchus are.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that the god of wine and song and revelry?
Yeah, so it fits. Come on. If he's going to be the god of anything, it's going to be the god of wine. So back in Rome, though, being called a god was a big no-no. A lot of those bad emperors of Rome later on got in trouble for this.
Now, see, I find that strange because isn't Octavian going to be declared a god?
Yeah, but it's after their death. When you're alive, being called a god or being associated with a god's a no-no. So yeah, after your death, good. While you're alive, no, that's too Eastern. In the East, that's totally fine. The Romans just considered it one of those weird things those Eastern people did. But Mark Antony leaned into it. He liked it. And
I will say, to go back to our observation about claiming to be descendant from Hercules, if you do say that you are the incarnate Dionysus, wow, talk about pressure every time you host a party, right? When people come to your place for New Year's Eve, they expect to have a good time.
I think he could probably drink people under the table. So if there's a man who could live up to it, it would be Mark Antony, I think.
Okay. Well, how about we just end his story now? I mean, things are going so well.
Everything's great. Everything's great.
Because we had such ominous warnings at the top of the podcast that things aren't going to work out well.
I'm sorry, babe. We've got to keep trudging on. Things will stay okay for a while. As an administrator, Mark Antony excelled in the East. He's good at this stuff. He's good at identifying talent, you could say. Many of the men he appointed in the East remained in their positions even after his downfall, which demonstrates their effectiveness, because Octavian had no reason to replace them. He wisely kept client kings who had sided with the liberators, knowing it would be disruptive to overthrow them all at once and put new kings in their place. He ruled reasonably, securing the loyalty of states bordering Parthia to ensure that he had safe passage for his army, and he could gain valuable intel on the Parthians. Also a smart move.
Well,
so he's keeping his eye.
That's clever.
What Mark Antony really needed, though, was funds for that war with Parthia. And he needed quite a few ships.
And isn't this where Cleopatra comes in?
Why are you preempting me, Matthew? I'm doing the lead up.
I'm latching on to anything that I can remember. And I know that their relationship is described as both political and romantic, but I don't know if I have that in the right order. Maybe the love comes first and then the strategy, or...
Oh, Matthew, we will talk about this. Because, it's a difficult one to parse through, especially from this far ahead. But yes, you are right. He needed resources, and there was only one rich and powerful state nearby that could provide that. That would be Egypt. This is where he summoned its queen and its pharaoh, Cleopatra, to him. Here we go. You knew she was coming. You knew she was going to enter the story in more than just a cameo. She's cameoed in the first 2 episodes, but now she's in it for good. To kind of recap, we spoke in the last episode about Cleopatra being in her own civil war against her brother husband. Yes, again, Ptolemaic incest. I know, it's weird.
It works for them, I guess.
Well, does it, though? Does it?
Well,
that husband had drowned, and then she married again to her younger brother, which also ended quickly as he died in 44 BC, likely not of natural causes. So at this time, Cleopatra had Egypt all to herself. No more family rivals. Cleopatra had also, importantly, given birth to a son, Caesarion, who she said was Julius Caesar's son. This fact would prove troublesome later, so think about that now. I do want to take a moment to consider the woman who came before Mark Antony. She will be vital to Mark Antony's life from here on out, so I do think we need to meet her in a little bit more depth. So Cleopatra, she was not the beauty that we're often given in movies and plays. She spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, Parthian, and even Egyptian, which was something that no other member of her ruling family had ever attempted or managed. Her voice, we were told, was beautiful, but it was her savvy propaganda skills and participation in Egyptian religious customs that truly won the hearts of the native population. They loved her. I like to say, think of her as the Anne Boleyn of her time, if we want to use another lady who used her charm and her brains to win people over.
Okay.
Under Cleopatra's steady rule, a depleted Egypt flourished, despite Roman control over Alexandria's ports. The Romans, they had their sticky little hands on everything in that area. I'm sure you know, because you do religious studies, so you know of like Judea in that time. It's the same thing with Egypt. The Romans are involved, even if they're not necessarily ruling there.
Right. And there is actually some foreshadowing here of differences that will surface centuries down the road in terms of, like you mentioned, the languages that she spoke. Mm-hmm. It's likely that Octavian spoke Latin and Greek, but his Greek was probably pretty rudimentary. It wasn't on his cultural radar to be, deeply immersed in other linguistic, cultural, religious traditions. That's going to be something that you'll see. I mean, believe it or not, because this is another little corner of my clubhouse, when we do get centuries down the road and you start to see some fundamental differences between what becomes the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western or Roman Catholic tradition, believe it or not, there are some fundamental differences that you could trace all the way back to this period.
Oh, wow.
Just in terms of, like, is your model for how you see the Mediterranean world politically, is it a Hellenic model, which on the one hand is very flexible in terms of allowing for what we would see as secular political leaders to be gods, but which would, in that sense, the model that we think Mark Antony might have been going for, I think, was much more open to local cultural autonomy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas, even though he's making himself an emperor, in theory, and after his death, a god, in theory, Octavian's model still has all these kind of Rome first elements.
Make Rome great again.
Right. The virtue of the Republic, even though he's kind of cementing the end of the Republic. So,
but it's the idea of it.
You'll see that, centuries down the road, when you're looking at Western Christianity, they'll assume the model that the Bishop of Rome is the equivalent of the emperor, and power, authority should flow down that pyramid. Like to this day, when the Eastern Orthodox Church has an argument about something, reproductive rights, same-sex marriage, environmental degradation, nuclear weapons, whatever it is, they vote. The bishops come together and vote. Whereas the Roman model still, in theory, you have to go from the Pope and then work your way down. But that is quite a bird walk from Mark Antony needing military support from Arthea. So I need to let you get back in charge.
That's okay. It's really interesting. I do think it's important to talk about in the East. There's territories that have been officially annexed by Rome. There are ones that have declined kings. It's just like a hodgepodge of things. And it does take a delicate hand, not necessarily an authoritarian hand, to do it. And I think that's why Mark Antony is really good at that. The Romans are involved in everything. So the point is, Cleopatra would need Rome on her side. Perhaps she intended to seduce Mark Antony, knowing his, should we say, fondness for the finer things in life, having met him before. Their famous meeting on Cleopatra's ship on the river Cydnus, designed to showcase Egypt's wealth and extravagance. This is an iconic moment. It's immortalized in art and literature. You see it a lot. You see it in Shakespeare, of course. Ancient historians claim that from the moment Mark Antony stepped on that ship, the weak-willed Antony fell hopelessly in love with Cleopatra, putting her above Rome. Consequences be damned.
So it is love.
Well, the thing is that characterization entirely fair? That's what the ancient historians will claim. Do we know if they were in love? I think those are all things that we can question. His relationship with Antony in fiction, movies, plays, everything, it's painted as one of the great romances in history, right?
Well, is it though? Because I know I'm not supposed to do much research, but some of what I read indicated that to the extent that the relationship was described as being born out of love, the way they put Roman sources sort of put love in air quotes and made it more like the foul seduction of a foreign, a foreign queen who's luring him into this trap to make him walk away from his own Romanness.
Well, I think that's fair. I think you could see it in several different ways, is what you're saying. So we have, if you're doing like a costume party, people go as Cleopatra and Mark Antony. It's just known as a great romance. The question is it a great romance? Is it Cleopatra using Mark Antony? Is it just an alliance that happened to have, benefits? What did I say about Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, allies with benefits? Is it any of those? Could it be all of those? It's so hard to find the truth of the matter when it's so long ago to know how people actually felt. But I will say, as we go, you can call me on it. I will point out areas where I think the evidence, the actions might show us something. But I think based on the evidence we have that the devotion that Antony showed to Cleopatra, when he really didn't need to, when it would have been beneficial many times over to abandon her and her cause, I mean, that reads like love. That reads like affection to me. It's so hard. Anybody could probably look at their story and come up with a different response. So I'm not saying that that's what happened.
I mean, I know this is silly, but you can't, unfortunately, the way we're recording, you can't really reach through and punch me for this. But for a first date, are we going to go roller skating? No, we're going to invade modern day Iran. It just doesn't strike me as a deep love connection there.
Well, first they're on the ship. They're hanging out on the ship. So at least in the beginning, we know, Cleopatra's doing what she did with Julius Caesar. Mark Antony is a very powerful Roman, and the Romans are top dog in the area. Cleopatra needs an ally, and Mark Antony was an ideal one, being the hero of Philippi. And yes, he needs something from her. So yes, it does seem like you both need something. So at least at this point, that's what it seems like.
Yeah, and maybe we're being overly simplistic when we try and make it one or the other.
Well, that's what I don't think that. I think it's so intertwined.
From your perspective, why can't it be both, right?
Yes. Why not both?
So in our own marriage, maybe we should occasionally talk about land wars
Invading.
just other nations that we'd like to.
Well, we have a nosy neighbor named Vivian. Maybe we should talk about invading Vivian's yard. Vivian, if you're listening, she doesn't know us. She has no idea our names, so
this will have to be cut from the podcast.
No, we didn't say her last name. I don't know her last name.
Well, this will have to be cut from the podcast.
It's not going to be done. Wow, whatever it was, love, lust, admiration, a mutual need for each other. We do know that the pair, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, they had that meeting on the ship. And then Mark Antony followed Cleopatra to Alexandria to spend the winter there. And in a world without birth control, their winter together would bear fruit, quite literally. Twins. They had twins.
Oh, wow.
Which is actually so surprising in the ancient world to have twins and both of them survive and the mother survive.
Right.
It'd be a boy and a girl. The girl would be Cleopatra Selene and the boy Alexander Helios. They would have another child, another son, about 4 years later, named Ptolemy Philadelphus. So for Mark Antony, Alexandria proved to be way more, well, fun than Rome. He loved it. He fit right in. I love this. There's this quote from the book. I referenced it in our first episode, Mark Antony, A Life by Patricia Southern. But there's this quote about Alexandria. Quote, they said that in Rome, Mark Antony wore his tragic mask, but for them, the Alexandrians, he exchanged it for his comic mask. End quote. This is where Mark Antony goes full Bacchus. He goes full Dionysus, which I think nothing proves that more than he founds with Cleopatra this club called the Inimitable Livers. It's like a drinking club. It's live drinking.
So they're literally, wow, it's about their own livers.
It is about their own livers.
Well, I have to plead my ignorance there. So in ancient medicine, they were aware that alcohol was bad for the liver, huh?
Maybe, or maybe it was just a happy coincidence. But yeah, it was a drinking club, and I mean, it was like, staying up late, doing all the fun things that people like to do when they're up late. We do get also a few stories from this time that color in the relationship that he had with Cleopatra. We usually don't get these kinds of stories for people that far in the past, so I do think it's worth recounting. My favorite of the stories is Mark Antony going fishing, where he struck out. He caught nothing. But to impress Cleopatra, he had his slaves put some fish that had already been caught on the line so he could, reel them in. It sounds like a sitcom, right? It was like, look, honey, I caught a bunch of fish. Well, Cleopatra's no dummy, and she knew what he did. So the next day she had her slaves put a salted fish on the line just to fuck with him and be like, I know what you were doing.
Oh.
A salted fish, which I'm sure just cracked themselves up. And I don't know. I love it. I think that's the best and cutest little story I've ever heard.
Yeah, that does kind of make me want to root for them now.
Yeah, doesn't that? You're like, oh, you crazy kids. Well, back in Rome, instead of lighthearted fish pranks, tension simmered between Octavian and Mark Antony's family. The instigators, Mark Antony's only remaining brother, Lucius, and Mark Antony's wife, Fulvia, because yes, remember, Mark Antony's having babies with Cleopatra, but he's still married. Octavian was struggling to find land for the veterans, which meant kicking farmers off their profitable plots, kicking a lot of farmers off their lucrative lands to put veterans who might have never even farmed before on it does not make one particularly popular. Fulvia and Lucius saw their chance. They see that Octavian's becoming less popular in Rome. And so they started to claim that Mark Antony's soldiers weren't being treated as well as Octavian's, that Octavian was prioritizing his own veterans over Mark Antony's.
Is that just a claim, or is there any truth to it?
The problem with getting that kind of evidence is Octavian's the winner. He wins this. So
Right.
there's a lot of times in this story, things will be kind of obscured by the lens of historians during his time, because most of these stories come from after Mark Antony's time. So they're being written under Octavian's rule. So we're not going to get the full picture is the point. So who knows? But I would believe it. The ancient historians often blame Fulvia for the chaos, but we know why, because that's just plain sexism. They're like, oh, Fulvia's stirring things up. But it does seem like her and Mark Antony's brother Lucius were using Antony's men and the displaced farmers to push back against Octavian. I doubt she harbored any love for her husband's enemy turned ally. The question remains, and we don't know whether Antony knew what they were doing, if this was his plan to put Octavian in his place, to try to make sure that he wasn't getting too powerful and that he was encouraging this opposition. He could also have plausible deniability because he's in Egypt, so we don't know.
Right. He's not there to be directly involved.
But he very well could be sending communications back and forth. One ancient historian argues Mark Antony orchestrated it, knowing he could distance himself if it failed. Ultimately, relations sour completely, forcing Fulvia and Lucius to flee Rome to Perusia, which is like modern-day Umbria in Italy.
Okay.
We call this the Perusian War, although war might be a little of an overstatement because of how brief it was. By 40 BC, it ended after a failed siege. Lucius, Mark Antony's brother, got off pretty easy. Octavian was not ready to move against Mark Antony at that time by killing his brother. So Lucius became governor of Spain, which was not so much a reward, but as kind of a way to keep tabs on him. He was basically little more than a prisoner. Fulvia fled to Greece to reunite with her husband, Mark Antony, who left Alexandria and Cleopatra behind for the time being. So, despite the image we get of Mark Antony and Cleopatra as inseparable, they do often spend these long stretches apart. The reunion of husband and wife was far from joyful. Fulvia expected gratitude but received none. Mark Antony was displeased, either because he didn't know about the plot or because he was disappointed that it had failed. Either one. You take your pick if you want to say whether he knew about it. We don't know if the topic of Cleopatra came up either. There are some ancient historians who say that Fulvia caused this entire war just to get Mark Antony away from Cleopatra.
Wow. That's commitment.
That smells like misogyny to me, just a little bit. But the couple never reconciled. Fulvia died of illness in Greece that same year in 40 BC without her husband by her side. This once loving marriage ended in bitterness and anger. It's a sad end. However he felt at the loss of his fearsome wife, Fulvia's death did turn out to be a blessing for Mark Antony. Without her alive, she became a convenient scapegoat, the fall guy, a fall girl, if you will. Both Octavian and Mark Antony could both blame their crumbling relationship on her. She had been the one to kick up so much trouble in Rome, after all.
Yeah, I don't know. Hasn't she been through enough? That now they're
I know.
from beyond the grave. They're
Fuck them.
Yeah, this makes it hard for me to root for.
I know. It sucks. But I do doubt either man actually believed that it was all her fault. But the fiction was perfect. As Mark Antony headed to meet Octavian, he's kind of having to answer for what just went on. The specter of another civil war is looming, exacerbated when Octavian's troops blocked Mark Antony from landing, leading to a skirmish. Tensions were rising, and the cracks in that triumvirate deepened. Adding to Mark Antony's worries, Octavian divorced Antony's own stepdaughter, who he was married to, and remarried a woman connected to Sextus Pompey. So it seems like Octavian's setting up the stage for a possible alliance against Mark Antony with Sextus Pompey, who's still at large. Mark Antony's seeing this, and he's getting a little worried. Octavian's getting the upper hand. But peace was briefly restored with a treaty in the fall of 40 BCE. Under the treaty, Antony ceded any remaining power in the West to Octavian. He's given it all. So if there was any claim that he had in the West, it's Octavian's. He gets control of the East officially with a dividing line through Illyricum. Antony was once again assigned the Parthian campaign because, yes, he still hasn't done that yet, while Octavian took charge of Italy and dealt with that persistent thorn in Rome's side that was Sextus Pompey. So they're renewing their triumvirate because Lepidus isn't there. Sorry, Lepidus, but...
It's a biumvirate.
Yeah, they're patching things up. Putting a little Band-Aid on it. Mark Antony can breathe a little bit easier now. He's not, at least at the moment, not going to war with Octavian. Again, while the treaty granted Mark Antony significant power, ceding the West to Octavian was ultimately a major mistake. Here's a quote from the book, which I think is really important. Quote, Antony had lost preeminence in the West and was never to regain it due to his absence from Italy and Rome after 39. End of the quote. His troops and potential recruits were in Italy. That's where he would have to get recruits from, where obviously he was not. It just reinforced the perception that he had shifted his focus east and neglected Rome, that he didn't care about Rome. Meanwhile, Octavian was present in Rome, projecting this ideal image of a Roman without any scandals, and he's investing heavily in public works like improved sewer systems, clean water, boosting his popularity. He's building up his base in Rome while Mark Antony's nowhere to be found. He's in the East. One question remains, why did Mark Antony allow himself to be sidelined? The book suggests that he might have believed Octavian would die at some point soon because he was always ill. So that's not outside of the realm of possibility.
So he's just biding his time.
Yeah, or maybe a victory in Parthia avenging Crassus would at minimum keep him from being eclipsed by Octavian. Ultimately, we can only guess what he was thinking. However, Antony never seemed to pursue a confrontation with Octavian. He was content with his eastern dominion. Perhaps after his victory at Philippi, he really felt that he had nothing left to prove. I think that would also be a valid reason. Antony, now a widower, strengthened his shaky relationship with Octavian by marrying Octavian's sister, Octavia. Yes, again, the names. Octavia.
The names aren't helpful.
No.
Well, I mean, in some ways they are. It's just that you end up with 4 or 5 children that all have variations on the same name.
I know. I just really have to make sure I enunciate. Octavia, she's the opposite of Fulvia. She's the anti-Fulvia. She'd be a devoted mother. She'd been married before, and she'd gone to have 2 daughters with Mark Antony, both named Antonia. So 2 daughters named Antonia.
Yeah, see, I just wish they would adopt some sort of like consumer electronics nomenclature. Like, okay, this will be my Max child, and this one will be my Ultra, and this one will be... I mean, that would help enormously. Not that I like that in our world.
They kind of do. They do minor and major, or the elder and the younger. So it'd be like Antonia the younger, Antonia the elder.
They're like streaming service tiers. Like this is my 3rd son. He's ad free. This is my 4th one. You can watch ESPN and Hulu with him. Okay,
just
all right.
A little bit.
Or you can just talk to Ultra, and then it's everything.
It worked for them. At least there's a differentiation.
You'll have to get a second mortgage on your house, but you'll be able to watch everything. Okay. Sorry.
There's multiple Antonia services.
One of my stupid observations.
Well, despite everything that's about to go down, Octavia would prove to be a devoted wife, regardless of how Mark Antony would treat her. And spoiler, he would not be as devoted to her as she was to him.
Is he devoted to anyone, really?
Maybe Cleopatra, you could make a case.
Yeah.
Speaking of how she felt about this marriage, who knows? I'm sure she would have felt it was strictly business. Mark Antony couldn't marry her because, according to Roman law, you can't marry foreigners. So it's not like he was going to marry her, but who knows? Mark Antony was preparing for the Parthian campaign, finally, in Athens that winter. He has his new wife, Octavia, by his side. The Parthians had begun to take over some Roman land, including Syria. They really need to be dealt with before the situation got even worse. So it was go time for Antony. Finally, this Parthian campaign is going to get underway, except just as Mark Antony was about to embark on this campaign, Octavian called him back to the west. Left out of the deal, Sextus Pompey was furious, and he was blocking the grain supply in Sicily, because later, all the grain to Rome would come from Egypt. Right now, most of it comes from Sicily. So he's blocking it, and he's causing famine and unrest in Rome, which is not great for Octavian, who would be pelted in the streets because of this unpopularity.
Oh, this is a problem that must be solved, and solved soon.
Yeah. Octavian had briefly pacified Sextus Pompey, with promises of government positions and a treaty, but that didn't even last a year before things spiraled into war. With little success against Sextus Pompey himself, Octavian had two options: either fully integrate him into the government or eliminate him entirely. I'm sure you know what they wanted to do.
Yeah, I think I can put two and two together this.
They chose war. Mark Antony agreed to provide Octavian with 120 ships, and in return, Octavian promised him 20,000 men for Antony's Parthian campaign.
Okay.
Sounds like a good deal, right?
Yeah, fair trade.
Yeah. Wow. Mark Antony would never see those men, a fact he wasn't aware of yet. He does give Octavian the 120 ships right away. Octavian's got the ships, but Octavian never upholds his end of the deal. Once again, you're like, Mark Antony, why are you expecting the best from Octavian? I just want to shake him and tell him to wise up, which, spoiler alert, he never will. Mark Antony did get to reunite with Cleopatra and their baby twins for a bit in Antioch before his campaign, after he sends Octavia, the wife, and his kids away, because he had already had those two daughters by Octavia at this point. He just gets right to business. There's some speculation that Cleopatra and Mark Antony got married at this time, but obviously there's a problem with that, which I'm sure you can see.
Well, he's not allowed to do that, right?
Exactly. He's already married.
I realize that he can't marry a foreigner, but he also is in his second marriage now?
Third.
Third, right. But it's, yeah unless he's a bigamist.
Can't do that.
Okay, so that's probably not true.
There's ideas that maybe they just went through some sort of Egyptian ceremony, some Egyptian rite. It's all speculation. People say, oh, it was here at Antioch. Some people say it was later in Alexandria. There's endless speculation of if they ever did get married. If he ever put a ring on it, who knows? I did want to put out that there is an idea that maybe they got married at this time in Egyptian fashion, whatever that would mean. Cleopatra would become pregnant with their third child, a son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, after this reunion. Again, he's so fertile. He's had how many kids? But then came time for that long-awaited campaign in Parthia. I know I just keep talking about it, and I know it kind of sounds like Infrastructure Week, that it would never happen. But
right, I'm kind of starting to wonder if this is, well, actually, I do know that it does happen.
Yeah, so it does. It does happen, unfortunately, for Mark Antony.
A two-year campaign, I think?
Maybe? I don't know. I didn't write that down. I don't want to go in deep with every little bit of the campaign, as the details don't really matter to our story, but the point is it was a failure. Mark Antony's military tactics had left the very large baggage train of supplies woefully behind him, which was just easy pickings for the Parthians. So say goodbye to your supplies. Eventually, with everything seemingly going wrong and winter upon them, Mark Antony had to retreat. The retreat reads nightmarish. We already had Oregon Trail in the last episode. This isn't much better.
Right. But that worked out okay for him because
It did.
He's granted Gaul eventually.
Yeah, he always seems to power through. First, in order to get discipline, Mark Antony began decimating his troops 5 days into the retreat. Do you know what decimating is? Can you explain it to our listeners?
Well, I may be explaining it wrong, but as I understand it, when a legion was engaged in disorderly conduct, to restore discipline, 1 out of every 10 soldiers would be randomly selected to be executed.
Yep.
So as
you got it.
Yeah, inspire among everybody else the willingness to stick it out. I don't know how effective it was as a technique, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it would do the opposite to me, but who knows? With limited rations, thanks to the Parthians destroying the baggage train, the men resorted to eating a root that induced delirium, madness, and ultimately death, likely due to a harmful fungus. They think it's like probably one of the ones that you get LSD from or whatnot.
Oh, ergot.
Sure. Yeah, the men who ate it would keep turning over stones like over and over and over again until they just vomited and died.
Yeah, that's
horrifying.
Actually, there's some speculation that may have played a role in the Salem witchcraft trials.
Yeah,
too.
Yep, I've heard that.
And then when I was in elementary school,
you ate it?
Well, now this is a strange tale, but you can look it up. It's true. This would be the late 70s or early 80s. Appropriately enough, it was a batch of Roman meal wheat bread.
What?
That had been distributed to all the St. Louis area public schools. And they raced into the cafeteria to yank it off of our trays because it had ergot contamination. And I guess,
dear Lord.
I guess apparently there were some kids that day at recess that kind of tripped out and had, deep conversations with the jungle gym. And
oh God, it's horrifying.
We're having way too much fun on the swings.
I hope they got a settlement because of that.
Yeah, well, I don't think it lingered in their system for very long.
Well, in this case, it killed them. They just vomited and died.
But then again, they weren't at least decimated, because that strikes me as
unfair. Much
more. Yeah, just talk about having the odds not go in your favor.
The Parthians also continued to attack the rear, causing thousands of casualties. Once they reached the safety of Syria, Mark Antony sent a desperate plea to Cleopatra for supplies and money, which she actually personally delivered, despite it being winter, and winter has really rough sailing conditions. So this act, again, this is one of the ones where I'm like, it kind of reads like a deeper emotional connection between them beyond just a political alliance. Because I would deliver supplies in the winter to you, babe.
And I would do the same for you. But I would point out that then that means that for everyone that she drags with her, if it is really love that's driving this rescue mission, gosh, think about her poor subordinates. It's like, why are we risking our life on the sea this winter? Why are we marching into Syria? It's like, well, the boss fell in love with this guy, and he doesn't know how to guard his supply lines. So you and I have to risk our life.
When you say that, why else would she, if she's just an ally, wouldn't you just be like, well, I'll get to it in a couple months, and also going personally.
Yeah, maybe that's a data point in favor of the connection between them being genuine.
Mm-hmm. And while waiting for her to arrive, Mark Antony's drinking spiraled out of control. He'd reportedly just go and look outside constantly, waiting to see her ships. It's sweet/sad.
So apparently the supply line attacks never got to the most important stash, huh? Okay.
Well, you probably had the stash closer to him. I don't know. But to be fair, they were back in Syria, so they were in friendlier areas. But yeah, the point still stands. Whether the Parthians' campaign's failure was later enhanced by Octavian, we don't know. These stories could be exaggerated, we will say, because we are getting it years later. Regardless, it wasn't a success. And to add insult to injury, Octavian finally did defeat Sextus Pompey. This is a sharp contrast to Mark Antony's poor showing in Parthia. Mark Antony's shine as this great military leader had started to tarnish. But more importantly, at this time, the triumvirate lost its third member, poor Lepidus. No, he's not dead. No R.I.P. I know you've probably forgot that already. Again, that
every time he's brought up, it's like, oh right, Lepidus. So you're saying he's not dead?
He's not dead. Well, sweet baby Lepidus. After Sextus Pompey was defeated, Lepidus tried to claim Sicily as his own territory, but was swiftly put in his place by Octavian, and essentially he gets exiled to Rome for the rest of his days. He's kept alive, but he's neutered. He's politically powerless. He's never allowed to take up office for the rest of his life.
Wow. So he just sort of retires in obscurity, huh?
With Lepidus gone, you can see that fragile balance between the remaining triumvirs. That's not going to hold out for long. We saw the same thing when Crassus died with the first triumvirate. It was time for Octavian to start setting the stage for a final showdown with Mark Antony. Mark Antony, he did not help himself. Octavia, his poor Roman wife, she tries to come see him after the Parthian campaign, but he sends her away before she had even reached there. He says, no, go back to Rome. He's having none of it. Why? We don't really know. We don't know what he was thinking. Compared to her brother, Octavia does seem like a sweet baby. So you do feel for the woman. But her brother, Octavian, in Rome, he's just like, ooh, this is an opportunity. This is great. This is another unforced error by Mark Antony. He gave his enemy something to weaponize. A war of propaganda began in earnest, launched at Mark Antony by Octavian. It had always been kind of going on in the background, subtly, with Octavian. He's making himself the anti-Mark Antony in Rome, but now it's launched with renewed viciousness. How dare Mark Antony send away his virtuous, loving Roman wife and choose this luxury-loving foreign queen, that kind of thing.
This is when the propaganda mill kind of fires up.
Octavia would stay at Mark Antony's home in Rome, raising his children, including his children with Fulvia, so not just their children, until Mark Antony finally divorced her and then kicked her out of the house. Not a great moment for him. But the split with Octavia, this initial sending her away, the divorce, this is just the first event.
The next action was worse and played right into Octavian's hands. The donations of Alexandria is infamous in the lore of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Do you know this?
I do. I did a little bit of research into this.
Well, in 34 BC, they have like a parade in Alexandria.
It's not what it sounds like. To my ear, of course, is this some sort of noble act of charity? But no, we're talking about the dispersal of property to people who, in the eyes of a Roman traditionalist, should not have access to that property.
So, Mark Antony, after this parade, he has Cleopatra on her throne at his side. He granted territories to their 3 young children. Some areas like Parthia or obviously beyond Roman and Egyptian control. But hey, it's never stopped monarchs before. I'm looking at you, English kings who called themselves kings of France. It does sound weird to us.
You know, that's in the news right now.
What, the France thing?
Yeah, that's one of the 14th Amendment birthright citizenship debates. I don't know if we're allowed to wander into that territory or not, if the podcast is allowed to become political. But
I'm just like, why? Out of curiosity, why?
Well, the 14th Amendment says if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen, but there is a qualifying clause that says born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And there are two exceptions that have emerged in the case law for where someone born on U.S. soil would not be considered a citizen. And the first one would be if you were the child of a diplomat. You know, imagine you're the ambassador from Portugal and you give birth in the United States. You don't want your son, when they turn 18, to have to go fight in a war that Congress declared.
Drafted. Yeah.
Right. So that was always considered to be a viable exception. And the other one goes all the way back to early English common law notions of subjecthood or citizenship, which took place against this evolving backdrop of Wales eventually getting attached to England, eventually getting attached to Scotland and a greater Britain. So anyway, as part of that, the argument began to emerge. Well, what about all this territory? What about all this dirt that we claim in northern France? And what about the fact that there are sizable chunks of that territory that the French just have the gall, pun intended, I suppose, to claim as theirs, right?
Yeah.
So when those French families give birth to children on, Henry's English land, are they citizens of or subjects of England? And they said, well, no. If you are the child of an occupying army, then you're not subject to the jurisdiction. You're not a citizen. So those were, for a long, long, long time, the only two constitutional case law precedents where it was held that being born here would not make you a citizen.
I did not know
but
that.
Today there's a movement to try and reevaluate that section, and that's probably where I should stop. So,
well, back to Cleopatra and Antony and their babies. It does sound really weird to us giving out land, but this move actually wasn't far off from the Roman norm of installing client kings in newly acquired territories.
But not for your children with a foreign queen.
Sure, these client kings were toddlers, but the point still stands. Antony also proclaimed Cleopatra as Queen of Kings and her 13-year-old son, with Julius Caesar, Caesarion, as King of Kings. He also declared Caesarion the legitimate heir of Caesar, which Octavian certainly would have taken as an act of war. In Octavian's eyes, there's only one heir of Caesar, and it was him. The reaction in Rome. You want to guess the reaction in Rome? I'll say that. How about?
To the donations.
Yeah.
What I want to say is that they would be appalled. But there's a part of me that wants to pause and ask, is the general public authentically appalled, or are they angry because Octavian sees this as a useful development to build public sentiment against a rival?
It's a good question. We don't know.
Because we don't have any mechanism for measuring public
it's not like we have
opinion.
public polling. There's no public polling. That's hard to say, but from what we're told, it was disastrous for Mark Antony's already declining reputation. It solidified the belief in a lot of people. So if you had already thought, he's getting a little too Eastern, this solidifies the belief that he was no longer a Roman. He was seen as Cleopatra's creature through and through. It's just difficult to understand what he was thinking as he seemingly continued to erode his standing with the Roman people. To be fair to him, though, soon after, Mark Antony did seem to realize that this once great reputation as the victor of Philippi and Julius Caesar's deputy had been forever altered. He launched a war of words against Octavian, reminding everyone that Octavian had never delivered those promised 20,000 men for the Parthian campaign. So, remember those?
You told me not to expect that promise to actually bear any fruit. And apparently it didn't.
Hey, guys, remember I fulfilled my end of the bargain? He did not. He also brought up grievances from the Perusian War that Octavian favored his troops over Antony's. Antony even threw Octavian under the bus for his treatment of Lepidus, who I'm sure just appreciated being remembered. My favorite, though, is Mark Antony called out Octavian for his own sexual escapades. Octavian wasn't quite the chaste little husband he liked to pretend to be.
Oh, right. You indicated that in the last episode.
He likes to pretend, but we know he liked the ladies. Mark Antony essentially told Octavian, come on, man. You know sleeping with women means nothing. He's trying to clear his own name for having shacked up with Cleopatra. To quote the book, quote, he also asks why there should be any surprise concerning Cleopatra, given that she is my wife, end quote. Again, do we know if they got married? Maybe in an Egyptian ceremony. Who knows? But there's a chance, and he does say wife. Perhaps the single most dangerous accusation that Antony leveled was that Octavian and his thirst for power were the one true obstacle to Rome ever having a republic again.
Whoa.
True. Side note, true. Yes.
No, what a profound accusation to level at him, and prophetic. And for somebody who Cicero hated, I assume he expressed that in a pretty, I doubt he's not known for being eloquent or sophisticated in his speech.
He's got the earthy soldier speak.
But maybe, there's something you could put on a bumper sticker of your chariot that would really prove to be a pretty legitimate forecast for what was going to happen.
Yep. You can say a lot of things about Mark Antony, but he was not wrong here. To be fair to Mark Antony, again, that's proven very true. So in Rome, Octavian, he called a meeting of the Senate, then barged in and proceeded to illegally sit between the consuls.
Oh.
I don't know, just like a little tight squeeze. He told the Senate he had actual proof of Mark Antony's duplicity. It's after the sheer chaos of this meeting, which the book calls pandemonium, that both consuls and 300 senators fled to Mark Antony's banner. So they just get up and leave Rome, which sounds like a crazy escalation, right? Like you're like, whoa, but that's a lot. But to quote the book again, quote, senators do not uproot themselves and sail to another part of the world because of a few speeches in the Senate House. There can be no record of what preceded these events because Octavian had vested interest in obscuring the opening stages of the war. He had carefully engineered it for his own ends. And so both for contemporaries and indeed retrospectively, he had to make it seem that he was saving the state from a terrible menace, end quote.
It's hard. We do know, and we kind of joked at the top that I provided a spoiler about how Mark Antony's end will befall him and Cleopatra. But this would be a point where if you didn't know the story, if you were learning it the first time, you wouldn't predict the outcome.
No, I don't think so.
Based on where he is right now. Because he is a leader. He has charisma. Arguably, his contributions are just as significant as Octavian's at this point.
If not more, at least his military, at least in the military sphere.
Right. And you could even make an argument that if you were trying to game out a larger Roman world in the Mediterranean, that what he's doing in the East, I mean, why not pursue a long-term strategic alliance with Egypt that's based on some sort of co-equal status instead of complete subjugation?
No, it's not a bad idea.
These are the intervening details that I was just completely ignorant of.
Yeah.
Along with the fact that they apparently knew excessive drinking was bad for your liver.
So. Well, Octavian may have been a devious bastard, but he knew the Romans had no appetite for another civil war. After all, how many had the Romans fought in the past few decades? They had just dealt with Sextus Pompey. Plus, it should be pretty clear from what I've said so far that Mark Antony, he was not on the offensive. He's not making any moves against Rome. He seemed more than happy with what he had in the East. What would allow Octavian to move against him and excite the people was a war against a foreign enemy, and who stood by Mark Antony's side? Cleopatra, with her immensely wealthy Egypt. Cleopatra was trying to make Egypt stronger. She was not coming for Rome in any sense, but the reality didn't matter. Make no mistake, Mark Antony was the real target. By aligning with Cleopatra, Octavian could strike at Antony while avoiding the appearance of a civil war. As much as Octavian would like us to believe that Mark Antony was plotting against him from the start, which, again, untrue, Antony's real flaw was just waiting too long to see their alliance crumbling. This first showed when their fallout occurred just after Octavian arrived in Rome, following Caesar's death. You just wish that Mark Antony had learned from that mistake, but it seems to be a character flaw. Was he just too relaxed? It seemed like he was also the last person in the world to realize that there was no going back from it with Octavian. But at long last, finally, it's around this time that Mark Antony began to assemble an army with Cleopatra by his side. To turn up the heat on the negative sentiment brewing against Mark Antony, Octavian removed Mark Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins and publicly read it. Who knows if it's the real deal or if it was a forgery? Some speculate that it was partially forged because it was exactly what Octavian needed. It shocked the Romans.
So what did it say?
Antony was leaving his Roman lands and possessions to foreigners. They're his children, but still. He even asked to be buried in Alexandria with Cleopatra, not Rome. It confirmed everyone's fears that Mark Antony had turned his back on Rome for good, for eternity, with, being buried in Alexandria. I can just picture Octavian cackling like a villain. Everything was going to plan. So from this point on, Mark Antony faced a Cleopatra problem. It would be his undoing. It really was a catch-22. He needed Cleopatra's support, her troops, her ships, her wealth. To stand a chance against Octavian, it's unclear if, she wasn't by his side, if her troops and her men would leave, if it would cost him the loyalty of them. But Cleopatra's presence was off-putting to some Romans around him. So in these early stages of the war, 2 of his best generals deserted him to go to Octavian. One had even told Mark Antony the harm that was coming from his association with Cleopatra, and he had obviously been ignored. It is true that the couple remained together far longer than was politically viable, which this is where I'm saying this to me reads affection, if not love. She was there because she wanted to be there, and he wanted her there. Cleopatra, she might have saved Egypt by leaving Mark Antony at this time if she had just abandoned him. And Mark Antony would have been a harder target without her by his side. But it was not to be. Fate had other plans. And to be fair, if we want to be fair about it, Octavian would likely have found a way to get Egypt regardless, because he needed its riches to fund his armies, who expected to be paid. Armies don't work for free.
Right.
And with Caesarion proclaimed as Caesar's heir, as Julius Caesar's heir, real heir, Octavian couldn't allow that to stand. His power hinged on him being Julius Caesar's heir. In terms of strategy, Mark Antony wanted to avoid any land battles and preferred to stay close to the coast. Some accused him of prioritizing Egypt above everything. Perhaps he did. it gets really hard to construct the chronology of the campaign with Octavian's propaganda only emphasizing the success of his army. So it makes it really difficult. Octavian did have a very skilled commander of his fleet, his friend Agrippa. It's Agrippa, not Octavian, who will eventually win the war. Agrippa's fleet had made resupplying very difficult for Mark Antony's legions. Mark Antony wanted a battle. He needed it. They needed to battle and battle quick. Yet, rather than moving to engage Octavian, not Octavian, it's Agrippa's forces. He and his army just remained in the same place. They're just waiting it out, waiting for the other side to engage them, which they're not. I'm sure you could see where we're leading. An immobile army is not good.
Right.
This is where you get disease set in with dysentery and malaria, killing men as they're just sitting, waiting for battle.
Right. This is one of those observations that I often have to make with my own students is until really the modern period, certainly throughout the entire ancient world and well into the 18th, 19th centuries, your losses in war are more likely to come from disease than they are from battlefield combat deaths.
And as disease sets in, morale plummets, and there are desertions to Octavian's side. Those are increasing. Even some of Antony's most trusted men left him. He would have to resort to executing a senator to try to get some semblance of discipline, which led to more desertions and rapidly falling morale. He's in a bad place. And if Cleopatra and Antony needed more support from the East, they were not going to get it. Octavian played a great game. I know you're a baseball fan, so we're going to call this his perfect game, his no-hitter.
Oh, he pitched a perfect game, huh?
He did. He managed to turn all the eastern provinces, all the client kings against Antony and Cleopatra by once again using Cleopatra as a scapegoat. She would be coming for them, he told the eastern client kings and governors. Better to ally with him than to be conquered by a woman.
More misogyny.
Yeah, was she coming for them? No. Unlikely. She didn't seem like she was bent on ultimate conquest, whatever Octavian would want people to believe. She was just very focused on Egypt, that we have no indication that she was trying to come for Rome or any of these other client kingdoms. The Battle of Actium is often portrayed as the end, but I like to think of it as the first step towards destruction for Mark Antony and Cleopatra. During the battle in September of 31 BC, Cleopatra's flagship had left the harbor, headed towards Egypt. We don't know if this was planned or she panicked or what, which when her ship leaves, it leaves a massive hole in their defense. Mark Antony's ship was under heavy fire, and he had to leave on a smaller ship to catch up with Cleopatra's, which he eventually then goes from this smaller ship onto hers. So they had to flee, and they only had a few ships left after the battle. During those 3 days at sea, Mark Antony just stayed in the bow of the ship. He's just overwhelmed, and he's just stunned into silence. We know he's a man of boisterous energy. Silence did not come naturally to him. It's just like all of his energy had been drained from him. He's not planning. He's not doing anything. He's just sitting there.
Sullen, defeated.
Yeah.
Beaten down.
I mean, he's been at a breaking point many times before. You referenced earlier, he's had so many comebacks, too many to even count. And he's managed, against all odds, to turn it around. He must have sensed that this time was different. A good friend to the end, he offered his friends an out. He wanted them to abandon him. He would even give them money and a means to do so, which I do think that says something that in his darkest hour, he thought beyond himself.
Yeah, that's noble.
He wanted to save others, even if he couldn't save himself. If Mark Antony was already admitting defeat and wallowing, Cleopatra worked to save herself in Egypt. She's just trying to prepare the country for war when Octavian and his forces got there. Eventually, Mark Antony traveled to Alexandria to be with her. He has this little time out in the desert, just wallowing. And then he comes back to Alexandria, where she's just trying to shake him out of his despair with things that she knew he loved, the drinking, the partying. She's just trying to do anything to get the old Mark Antony back. She in Egypt needed him.
Because it's a defeat, but it's not like all of Egypt has suddenly succumbed, right?
Exactly. They don't have a lot of ships and they don't have a lot of options, but she's trying to rally him and rally the troops. Yet his mood just remains unchanged. He just remained in that stupor. He traded out the inimitable liver club for a new club fit for his mood, which was called the Inseparables at Death.
Oh.
Not a club I want to join.
Right.
Eventually, it really does seem like Cleopatra, too, knew what awaited her. The people of Egypt, they loved her, and they wanted to fight for her, even recruiting an army made up of everyday Egyptians. They're like, we're gonna do it. We're gonna fight off Octavian and the Romans. But Cleopatra said no. She was unwilling to see more of her people die when they all knew the ending. Cleopatra at this time would send her son Caesarion, who was now 16, away to escape because she knew what Octavian would do if he got his hands on Caesar's son. Winter had set in, so no fighting would happen. Actium's in September. They have a whole winter to just steep in this deep sense of sadness. Letters went back and forth between Octavian and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Mark Antony, already resigned to his fate, proposed a solution to Octavian. He'd kill himself if Octavian would spare Cleopatra and Egypt.
Do we have any of those letters?
I don't think so. I think they're just referenced in some of the historians. So there's a chance that the ancient historians might have seen them, but I don't think we actually have them. So he says, I'll give myself up. You spare Cleopatra in Egypt. Not going to happen. Octavian needed Egypt if he had any hope of paying his soldiers. Octavian offered Cleopatra a deal, give him Mark Antony, and she and Egypt would get off easy. It's questionable if he would have followed through. Still worth noting. Cleopatra refused the offer. I believe this gives us more of a hint about some sort of genuine love between the two, that they couldn't let the other go. They each had a chance to, well, Mark Antony was sacrificing himself and Cleopatra had a chance to give up Mark Antony. I think that says something.
Absolutely.
When spring came in 30 BC, it was time for Octavian to finish his mission. Desperation took hold as Mark Antony, he challenged Octavian to single combat. Not going to happen.
And I do know about this. Apparently, Octavian's answer was that it would be beneath someone of his station to engage in a trial by combat to determine the outcome of this dispute. So also convenient because he knew he would probably lose.
Oh, yeah. He was not a fighter. Again, Agrippa won most of his battles. Some people say, too, that he said that Antony could find better ways to die. Instead, a final battle was set for the following day, the 1st of August. With that, Mark Antony had what would be his last supper. Plutarch, an ancient historian, recounts that as the slaves poured his wine and served his meal, he wondered if they would be serving him the next day or another master. It was a night cloaked in despair, knowing where the next hours would take him. And this is where myth and history collide, as Plutarch also mentions these strange occurrences in Alexandria that same evening. The signs, the omens, things that the ancients held dear drifted over the city of Alexandria that night. Haunting music wafting through the city and sightings of some ghostly apparitions. So you just hear this music, but they can't see anybody playing it. The ancient writer Plutarch said it was the god Bacchus leaving the city, the god that he had most associated himself with, had modeled himself after, had abandoned Antony. This obviously reads as poetic license rather than straight history, but it's so good, it's impossible to leave out. You can kind of just feel the dread, like it's humidity sticking to your skin. It just leaves me with goosebumps. There's this poem that's written much later in the 20th century about this spooky event called aptly, "The God Abandons Antony." I did want to quote my favorite lines from that poem. Quote, "When suddenly at midnight you hear an invisible procession going by with exquisite music, voices, don't mourn your luck that's failing now, work gone wrong, your plans all proving deceptive. Don't mourn them uselessly, as one long prepared and graced with courage, say goodbye to her, the Alexandria that is leaving." End quote.
That's beautiful.
I know. On the 1st of August, Mark Antony's fleet went out to battle like normal and then immediately switched sides. Antony would flee back to the city of Alexandria, knowing this is when all hope is lost. He's done. Mark Antony's death likely played out the same way we see it in movies and plays. In Alexandria, Cleopatra was holed up in her mausoleum. So it's not surprising that Antony believed it when he was told that she was dead. She's in her mausoleum. Checks out. Like all virtuous Romans, there really was only one option left for Mark Antony: to kill himself.
And now we're coming up on, this is the true last chapter.
Yeah. It said he asked a slave to kill him first, but the slave killed themselves to avoid having to kill Mark Antony. I don't know. Is this true? Is it just more slander against Mark Antony, saying he couldn't even do the job himself? Antony attempted to kill himself with a sword. Unfortunately, he only managed to gravely wound himself. It was a fatal wound, but not quickly. It was only then that he learned Cleopatra was alive. He was hoisted up via a pulley to get into Cleopatra's mausoleum, where the great Roman general died in her arms. He was about 53 years old. Cleopatra, unwilling to be paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph, outlived Antony by only a few days, so she died too on August 10th. There's a good chance that she did die, like the story goes, from a snake bite, with her loyal followers joining her in death. She was 39 years old. Though we don't have their tomb, we are told that Octavian did have the lovers buried side by side.
Oh, well, one final act of kindness.
Kindness.
And what was otherwise a pretty... Well, then again, though, you know what? I was about to say one final act of kindness and what was otherwise a pretty savage agenda on his part. But then it occurs to me that, you know, if they're buried together, it just confirms his claims that Mark Antony had fallen under the wiles of a foreign queen.
Yeah, and there would be more blood to be spilled, too. Octavian would find the teenage Caesarion and have him killed. He'd learned the lessons well from his adopted father, Julius Caesar, who had spared Brutus and Cassius once. Octavian would not make that mistake. He couldn't have any remaining heirs of Julius Caesar hanging around. One of Mark Antony's sons with Fulvia, the 14-year-old Antyllus, he was killed too, supposedly dragged out from an unfinished temple dedicated to his father and murdered right there.
That's brutal.
I do want to do like a mini-sode on the Patreon about what happened to Mark Antony's 3 children with Cleopatra. So if you're a Patreon member or want to be, look out for that soon. With their parents gone, though, they were taken to Rome. Octavian would make them be in the triumph, the parade through Rome streets, celebrating the death of their parents. And with that, once independent Egypt became a part of the Roman Empire, there'd be no more pharaohs of Egypt. Octavian, with no other rivals left, became the first emperor of Rome. The Roman Republic would never be restored. Whew.
Yeah, that is quite a journey.
Do you want to do the judgment now, or do you want to do it in a separate episode? What do you think?
I think people deserve a judgment now, don't you?
Okay, we've reached the end. That means if you know the show, it's judgment time, and this is baby's first judgment. Are you nervous?
Is it my first judgment? I thought I was in on the John Brown, Erin Burr.
Oh yeah, I guess. Okay, baby's second judgment.
I don't know that the audience is aware that baby is my nickname, but I guess they know now.
Yeah. Well, okay. Normally I go first. Unless you want to go first. That's fine.
No, I think you should go first.
Okay. Well, we know Mark Antony's not a perfect person. I don't think I would want to be married to him, for one. And I do feel like there are moments of ruthlessness in him. Although I think you could probably take anybody, any general of that time, and get the same thing. I'm just trying to think. Good qualities. He's fun. He liked to party. He knew how to party. I do think he was really loyal. He was loyal to Caesar, to Cleopatra.
Not to his wives.
Well...
Oh,
yeah,
this is bad. I should not be interrupting your...
No, it's fine. No, interrupt away. I did just say, though, he'd be horrible to be married to, but he does have moments of loyalty. Especially with Caesar and Cleopatra, there are times it would have been very convenient to discard them when things got rough, but he didn't. He stood by his man and his woman. We just talked about him in the end, asking his friends to leave him. So I do think there are moments of selflessness in him. Same with Cleopatra. He tried to sacrifice himself so that she could get out of it for all the Bacchus loving, the Dionysus, the short tunics. He could be selfless at times. Like, if I was going to give him a number, oh no, I'd probably do like 75-25 good. I don't know. I expected more things to side-eyed about him. But in this story, I don't really see him as the villain, which is ironic because Octavian, who later becomes Augustus, he's held as like the ideal in terms of Roman emperors. He's the first and he's the ideal. He's had this almost unblemished reputation, although it does seem like lately that reputation's being questioned now. But up until now, he's had a great reputation. When I look at Mark Antony, I don't think he was going against Octavian. I don't think he was planning at any point. I think he was more than happy to just ride out his life in the East if he was let. If he was able to do it. That's kind of my opinion. What about you? Do you think I'm being too nice on him? You think I'm being too nice, don't you?
Well, I'm afraid that I'm going to make an observation here that will...
Oh, no.
That will...
Not that I'm too nice to men. You know that's not true.
Well, men very rarely deserve nice. But this is a dangerous question.
Oh, no.
Is it, before I reveal my score, are you sure you aren't elevating his score, his evaluation?
Because of his end? Because of his end?
No.
Is that what you're going to say?
No.
Oh.
Although that's a problem in historical analysis all the time. Well, I shouldn't say historical analysis. The professorial posture for all of this would be to say, well, it's not our business to make judgments like this. We don't even really know what the evidence is. So
the point of our show is to judge. Right. So fuck that.
Right, exactly. And we're not professors. So no. So my pointed question, and have
I spent way too much time with him?
No.
Is that what you say?
The fact that three different times during this podcast, and in part because I've raised the question. You've talked about how you feel that his relationship with Cleopatra was motivated by genuine affection. Mm-hmm. And relationships like that in the ancient world are, as I understand it, hard to find. Is it possible that that's contributing to your score? And if so, should it be?
No, I'm kind of taking Cleopatra out of it in terms of his reputation. Yeah, he's a little debauched, but I'm not thinking about it purely as a love story. I just think, okay, as you mentioned, Cicero was so scared that Mark Antony was going to be the person who ended truly the Roman Republic. Well, we know that's not the case. It was Octavian. Is he a great man? Obviously, he does things that are repulsive to us in our modern era, but
what I'm doing here, which is really malicious, is I'm waiting for the bell to ring because this is what I do in my classes. And then, students want to know, well, how do you feel? It's like, well, I'm sorry. You've got to get to algebra now. But I do have a number.
Before that, I will say that before, I was just kind of looking on the interwebs to see how people viewed Mark Antony. I was like, I'm just curious. Like, do people like this guy? There are some positives, like that he's a decent general. Obviously, a lot of negatives. I did see one person say that without the Cleopatra affair, that they think he'd be forgotten, that he messed up everything he touched, which we could debate that if you want to debate that. Is that kind of what you were trying to say? If we took Cleopatra out there, that he's kind of an unremarkable guy? Because I wouldn't go that far. I do think his downfall feels inevitable, and there are likely steps that he could have taken to avoid it with Octavian.
I suppose.
But Octavian also played, again, a perfect game, and he wouldn't rest until Antony was eliminated.
Right. And I think that's kind of where, for me, the biggest argument in his favor, the thing that boosts his score, is that while he has ambitions, he has normal ambitions that I would call Republican, little r, ambitions. He's there for the birth of the empire, right? The civil war that involves him is the third and final one that catapults us into the era of empire, but he acts in service of his own ambition without, to my mind at least, having some grander plan like Octavian does.
I don't think there was clearly no plan.
Or Caesar before him that,
yeah,
that he's going to try and dismantle these institutions. Now, I would like to think that's kind of why I latched onto that bumper sticker comment earlier. This is one of the challenges that just gets harder and harder the farther back you try and go in historical scholarship. It would be wonderful if we had some primary sources where he spoke to what his real principles were.
A diary or something. Dear diary.
Right. I would like to make a few notes about the Republican institutions of the last few centuries. That
getting psychology of anybody and that far back is impossible. So it's difficult. Just something we have to wrestle with.
With the decision to move his marriages out of the equation, which was that was what you did, my dear. I didn't suggest that.
I feel like every man we've talked about on here has been not a great husband. So I'm like, at this point, it's not just him. So it's hard to hold that. But
see, if every man has engaged in the callous disregard of their own marriage ties in the service of their career, why should we applaud him for having a love match with Cleopatra?
I don't think I'm applauding for that.
Oh, okay.
I'm not even factoring their story into it. If I took her separately, I think I would maybe have a different score. But let's
get to my math then.
Okay. Yeah, you do. Let me hear your math.
So I'm more 60-40 against him.
Against him?
Against
Ooh, controversial.
Well,
why?
This is why.
You don't like him? You don't like him? I've not convinced you to like him. You have not liked him as you've gone on. Because I feel like I had more of a negative opinion of him until I researched him. So I kind of reversed.
I think he's fun. I think he's ambitious. I think he is not out to destroy the Republic, and those are all points in his favor. But I don't think he ever denied the donations. He is supposed to be a loyal Roman citizen.
I did kind of try to tell you that it's not out of the ordinary.
Shouldn't that be the Roman Senate's decision?
At this point, the Senate's not going to get a lot of decisions. We'll say
I'm aware of that. I'm aware of that because of what Octavian is up to. But at least Octavian is...
He tries.
Is embracing his Roman identity.
But isn't that saying inherently that Roman identity is good, Eastern identity is bad? Isn't that what you're setting up?
I'm setting up a rubric that would measure his loyalty against the community that he's supposed to be representing or defending or expanding.
Mm-hmm.
By all means, if we're looking at it from the perspective of like a global score, I would probably go more 60-40 or 70-30 the other way.
I don't think we're approaching it from a Roman point of view. I think we're approaching
Well, but
it
see,
from...
that's where I think it gets tricky, because we have time and we have space. And within the time dimension, there are all sorts of things that you're letting him off the hook for, because you're saying, well, in the ancient world, that was just to be expected. That was just the way men behaved. So if we're willing to make that adjustment, contextualize the score to that particular era in history, then shouldn't we regionalize it to the expectations of the Roman world, in which case he should not be shacking up with an Eastern queen?
Yes, that's all valid.
I realize my method there looks very simultaneously. It's like jingoistic, chauvinistic, and nationalistic, and imperialistic.
I don't know if I agree in the way of approaching it that way. Yeah, maybe a regular Roman. You pull them off the street in Rome, they might agree with you, but they would also be like, yeah, go him. He should be sleeping around with everybody. Those sorts of things they would be totally fine with. So,
well, this analogy will fall apart upon the tiniest scrutiny. But I'm just going to throw it out there just because it'll be fun. It's like a piñata, and you can just knock it off the wall. But just imagine for a moment that you had a democratically elected leader. So they, in theory, should have been loyal to a certain set of value propositions. And then suddenly they seem to develop a real affection for foreign strongman dictators. Wouldn't you feel like it would be your patriotic duty to evaluate them in terms of the norms that they had broken from their own society, rather than applauding their commitment to multicultural dialogue?
But you also have to think that Mark Antony, he's in the East, but these are still
not that
places.
Cleopatra is Vladimir Putin. I'm not trying to
this is the East, but these are still Roman places, these provinces, these areas. They're still Roman. At no point does he actually say, fuck it, Rome, I'm not coming back. Yeah, they're reading that into him through his will and the donations of Alexandria. But
that's another fundamental problem in trying to have this discussion is I did look into the wills a little bit, and the thing that modern historians, or the will, I should say, and aside from the fact that Octavian has no right to go in there and grab the will.
And it could totally be a forgery or partially forged or whatever.
Right. What I've read is that of all the elements of the will, the one that makes it look the most suspiciously inauthentic, the thing that seems to cry out, oh, this looks like a forgery, is the claims about succession. Mm-hmm. That you can dismiss Mark Antony as being politically unstudied or in over his head or impulsive, but he would never have put down on paper.
Yeah, why? Why would he?
Why do that? It's like signing your own death warrant.
That would be so dumb. And I don't think he's dumb.
And if someone were to prove that that was in fact a forgery, my score would probably move a little bit closer to yours.
You need proof. I don't think you're going to get proof, babe. I don't think they're going to get forensic proof on it.
Well, that's why this score is in pencil.
It's so weird that you're if he was abhorrent to the Romans, that's your basis of your score.
Here, let me see if I can pin you in a corner here.
Oh God, no.
Here we go. This is a side I hardly ever bring out in our marriage, but I'll go ahead and do it.
Oh no. Oh no, I'm scared.
So this is the third civil war. This is the last military conflict that transitions us from the Republic to the Empire, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the aftermath of Octavian's death, he will be elevated to the status of a god. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And in his aftermath, many future emperors will make that claim or have that claim made about them during their lives, right?
Of which most of the Julio-Claudians, that's Augustus's dynasty, most of them, I think all of them but Tiberius, the second emperor, they're all related to Mark Antony. That's all through Mark Antony's line. So suck it, Augustus.
Right. So you could argue he lives on through his bloodline, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Oh, 100%.
But as I understand it, many of those future emperors, this is my fourth question.
Oh, God. They're bad.
And so far, remember, you just have to answer yes or no. Many of them we would not hold up as models of virtuous executive leadership.
Are you saying that's biology?
No. What I'm getting at here is
that's what the Romans would say.
Is that if the Republic was a light in the Mediterranean world, it's out after this point.
Mm-hmm.
And Mark Antony was one of the last people who could have prevented it from going out.
You don't think he tried hard enough to prevent it?
I don't think he tried hard enough because I think his imagination couldn't see beyond the next campaign or the next bottle of wine or the next night with Cleopatra.
Possibly. I mean, that is a trope. You know, he's normally presented, like if you watch any film or anything about him, as kind of careless, kind of aimless. Yeah, right. That he doesn't have that sort of foresight. Yeah, you could say that.
So that's informing at least part of my score.
If you're going to say that, in order to save the Republic, that would require starting civil war against Octavian. I think what you could say good about him is I think he really did do everything in his power to prevent civil war, especially in this last phase. He doesn't move against Octavian until Octavian's well past moving against him. So I don't think it's his fault. Octavian wants to say, oh, it's because of them. I didn't start it, but it's pretty clear that that's bullshit. I do think that if you're saying, okay, well, he didn't do well enough to prevent the fall of the Republic, well, I guess it would require starting a civil war, which I guess ended up happening anyway.
That's how I would see it.
But also, if I want to fight back, allying himself with Cleopatra outside of the love, take love or relationship out of it. Egypt, vastly wealthy. If you're going to have an ally, that would be who you would choose.
So oh, absolutely.
I think he did that right.
Oh, and anyone game planning the war would not have predicted the Battle of Actium, because that's one of the rare examples in the ancient world, as I understand it, where the Roman navy punches above its weight. Usually, the legions get all the attention. Their land armies are their most impressive military asset, and they're not a seafaring people, the way a lot of their rivals are.
Yeah, so, or they're earlier, like the Etruscans who came before Rome.
Although that's way outside any knowledge I have. It's okay if we disagree, isn't it? I mean, that's the whole point of the podcast.
No, it's not. I'm trying to get you to my side.
But think of how boring it would be for listeners if we ended up with the exact same score.
So you have a negative view of him.
Well, I'll go as far as 50-50.
Okay. Well, wait, how about does this make you like Octavian more or less?
Oh, no.
See?
I think he's really the problem because
he's the problem.
Because he has principles, but they're all the wrong principles.
Unfortunately for Mark Antony, he was in the way of Octavian getting what he wanted, which was to be top dog.
I would put it like this. I would say,
you don't think he fought hard enough.
Right. I think he has many qualities that we would consider to be positive elements of a moral character. His desire to do right by his men, his willingness to make sacrifices for them at the end, if we could ever find those letters. Apparently in those letters, he's trying to find compromises. He doesn't seem to be particularly motivated by vengeance. All those things speak to his character, his moral character.
Mhm.
But the comma that you have to throw down at the end of that sentence is, what about his moral imagination, right? Can he see the long-term consequences of what Octavian is doing and what that will mean for his people?
Yeah, and you're saying that he should have, based on that's the way things were going.
History put him in a position where if he doesn't
He should have been able to see. He should have been able to foresee. It's not a case where it would be impossible for him to foresee. He saw Caesar, he saw Pompey. He should have foreseen it with Octavian.
Well, it's apparently not going to be Lepidus because they've got him doing some kind of basic cable TV show in the basement of what will eventually be the Vatican. So I'm assuming it's up to Mark Antony.
I was going to say R.I.P. and then I was like, no, he didn't die at that, but he's dead now. So R.I.P. Lepidus. You're the true hero of the story. Yeah. You're the good one.
He could have done more.
So you wouldn't like Lepidus then in terms of your...
Well, at least Mark Antony tried.
Yeah. Harsh. Well, I think with that agreement/disagreement, most of ours are pretty close, but I guess that's just me and Jamie being a twin.
It's possible that because the two of you have a special bond, that maybe your scores will come out more.
We don't have a special bond, my dear.
I think ours is deep.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for sticking with us and getting to the end of Mark Antony's story and this judgment. Again, if you like this podcast, go rate it, review it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on Instagram. That's usually the place where we'll announce our new episodes and give you a preview of who's coming up next. And thank you again, Matt, for joining us on this little journey.
Thanks for having me as a guest. And hopefully I'll be in front of the microphone at some point in the future, but it'll be exciting to get Jamie back. So
yeah, she should be back here soon. Thank you guys. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye-bye.